She was so sure of herself, convinced that this teenage boy was just another shoplifter. But when he called his mom and she walked in, the manager's entire world flipped upside down. Jalen Merritt pushed open the glass door of Summit Kicks, stepping inside with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The air was thick with the smell of fresh leather and rubber soles, and the walls were lined with sleek, illuminated shelves stacked with the latest sneaker releases. For months, he'd been waiting for this day, checking online, watching reviews, comparing every detail of the Nike Zoom X Pro he wanted. The pair was sleek, all black with deep blue accents, built for agility on the court. He wasn't just here to browse, he was here to buy. The store wasn't crowded, just a few customers milling about, but one set of eyes was on him from the moment he walked in. Meredith Langley, the store manager, stood behind the counter, stiff-backed, watching Jalen like he had already done something wrong. She wasn't obvious about it, not yet, but she had worked in retail long enough to spot trouble when it walked through the door. And to her, Jalen fit the description. 16, tall, lean, dark-skinned, hoodie, hands in his pockets. She'd seen the videos. Groups of teenagers stuffing sneakers under their sweatshirts and dashing for the exit. She wasn't about to let it happen on her watch. Jalen, oblivious to her scrutiny, moved through the store, running his fingers lightly over a row of pristine high tops. He stopped at the display featuring the Nike Zoom X Pro, his sneakers. The price tag gleamed under the LED lights, $230. It was a lot, but he had earned it. Cutting grass, running errands, even washing cars on weekends. Every dollar was his. Meredith took a slow step forward. She was subtle, moving along the aisles as if straightening boxes, but her gaze never left him. Jalen crouched down, picking up the sneaker, turning it over in his hands, studying the sole. The grip pattern looked perfect. He imagined himself on the court, his footwork sharp, moving past defenders like they weren't even there. But before he could take the shoe to the register, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Do you need help with something?" Jalen looked up, blinking. The woman, Meredith, stood a few feet away, arms crossed. Her tone wasn't the friendly kind of, "Do you need help?" It was the kind with an unspoken, "Because I don't trust you." He glanced around. There were other customers, but she wasn't talking to them. Just him. Jalen straightened, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm good." She didn't move. "You sure?" There was a pause, a shift in the air. He felt it now, the weight of her suspicion pressing down. Still, he refused to react. He had nothing to prove. He took the sneaker, walked calmly toward the checkout counter, and placed it down. A young cashier, maybe in her early 20s, gave him a polite nod. "Nice pick. Want to try them on?" Jalen smiled a little. "Yeah, that'd be great." The cashier grabbed a box and turned to get his size. But before she could take 2 steps, Meredith cut in. "Hold on." Jalen looked up. The cashier froze. Meredith moved in closer, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I need you to empty your pockets." The store went silent. Jalen's hands, which had been resting on the counter, curled slightly. He let out a slow breath through his nose. "Excuse me." Meredith didn't flinch. "You heard me. Empty your pockets." A couple of customers turned their heads. Someone shifted uncomfortably near the back wall. The cashier's face paled, but she said nothing. Jalen felt the heat rise in his chest. He was used to this kind of thing. Not often, but enough to recognize the signs. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. But Meredith wasn't backing down either. She was convinced she had him right where she wanted. Jalen stood there, his pulse steady, but his patience wearing thin. He looked at Meredith, then at the growing number of eyes on him. "You think I stole something?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Meredith didn't hesitate. "I just need to make sure. Store policy." Jalen let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "Store policy?" He glanced at the cashier. "You ask everybody to empty their pockets?" The young woman looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between them. She didn't answer. She couldn't. A man near the racks shuffled his feet. A woman near the window whispered to her friend. The weight of their silence pressed against Jalen, thick and suffocating. Meredith squared her shoulders. "If you haven't taken anything, it won't be a problem." Jalen clenched his jaw. His hands stayed at his sides. He wasn't playing into this. "Not here. Not now. I walked in here to buy shoes," he said slowly. "I worked for them. I saved for them. I brought my own money. And you think I'd throw that away to steal?" Meredith gave a thin-lipped smile, the kind people use when they're convinced they're in control. "Then prove me wrong." Jalen felt a familiar heat in his chest, one he'd learned to push down too many times before. He glanced around again, scanning faces. Some looked away. Others stared openly. No one spoke. He knew exactly what would happen if he reacted the way she wanted him to. If he got angry, if he argued, if he even raised his voice. So he didn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate. He pulled out his phone, his wallet, and his house key, placing them on the counter with a soft thud. "There." His voice was measured. "Happy?" Meredith's gaze flicked to the items. There was nothing else. Still, she didn't back down. "Turn them inside out." A murmur rippled through the store. Even the cashier's eyes widened slightly. Jalen took a slow breath through his nose. "Are you serious?" Meredith folded her arms. "If you want to keep arguing, I can call security." There it was. The threat. The unspoken warning. Jalen could feel his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer frustration of it all. This was what people like Meredith did. They pushed you until you snapped, then acted like they were the victim. And Jalen wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. He didn't move, didn't give her the reaction she wanted. Instead, he picked up his phone from the counter and with one swipe, unlocked it. He tapped a number, raised it to his ear, and waited. Meredith's smirk flickered, just slightly. "What are you doing?" Jalen's gaze didn't leave hers. "Mom, can you come inside?" The words were calm, even, but there was something in them, something firm, something unshakable. Meredith's expression twitched. "Who are you calling?" Jalen ignored her. He just stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, waiting. And after a moment, through the heavy silence of the store, he heard it. The sound of heels clicking against the pavement outside. Then the soft chime of the boutique's glass door swinging open. And the moment Celeste Merritt stepped inside, the entire energy of the store shifted. But Meredith didn't know who she was yet. Not really. And she still thought she had the upper hand. Celeste Merritt stepped inside Summit Kicks, her presence commanding the room before she even spoke. She didn't rush. She didn't have to. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, deliberate and measured. Jalen exhaled slowly. Now things were about to shift. Meredith Langley, still standing with her arms crossed, barely spared Celeste a glance at first. She was too busy watching Jalen, waiting for him to crack. But when the young cashier nervously whispered, "Miss Merritt," Meredith's expression flickered. Celeste didn't acknowledge the cashier right away. Her gaze swept the store, taking in the scene, the way customers had subtly shifted away, the way her son stood behind the counter, tense but composed, and most of all, the woman who had made herself the center of this confrontation. Meredith finally turned to Celeste, eyeing her tailored navy blazer, silk blouse, and crisp, structured posture. "Can I help you?" Her tone was polite but dismissive, like Celeste was just another customer. Celeste's expression didn't change. "I believe you already have." The weight of those words made Meredith's lips press into a thin line. Jalen took a step closer to his mother. "She stopped me, accused me of stealing, told me to empty my pockets." His voice was calm, but beneath it, frustration simmered. "And when I did, she asked me to turn them inside out." Celeste's face remained unreadable, but her eyes darkened just slightly. She turned to Meredith. "Is that so?" Meredith straightened, suddenly more aware of the attention on them. "We have a responsibility to prevent theft. He was acting suspiciously. It's standard protocol." Celeste arched a brow. "And what exactly did he do that made you suspicious?" Meredith hesitated, just for a second. "He was lingering around the shelves, checking prices, watching other customers." Jalen let out a short laugh. "That's called shopping. A few people murmured in agreement. Meredith's gaze sharpened. I don't have to explain myself to you. Celeste smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Actually, you do. Meredith's jaw tightened. Look, I don't know who you are, but... Celeste cut her off. You don't know who I am? Meredith hesitated again. That second pause was all it took for doubt to creep in. Jalen, arms crossed, let the silence hang for just a beat before delivering the blow. She owns this place. Meredith's eyes flickered. A few employees exchanged glances. The young cashier, still frozen behind the counter, looked like she wished she could disappear. That's impossible, Meredith scoffed, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Celeste finally moved, slowly reaching into her purse. She pulled out a leather card holder and flipped it open, revealing an ID with her name and founder and CEO printed in crisp black letters. Meredith stared at it, then at Jalen, then back at Celeste. The realization hit all at once. Celeste Merritt. The same name printed on every Summit Kicks business card. The same woman whose framed portrait hung in the back office. An office Meredith had walked past every single day. The blood drained from Meredith's face. Celeste took a slow step forward. You've worked here for how long? Meredith swallowed. 3 years? Celeste tilted her head. 3 years. And in all that time, you never thought to learn who signs your paychecks. Meredith opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no good answer. Jalen shifted, looking at his mother, waiting. Because now the real moment was coming. But Celeste wasn't done yet, not even close. The store was dead silent. Every pair of eyes flicked between Celeste and Meredith, waiting for what would come next. Meredith's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Jalen could see it now, the cracks in her confidence, the slow realization sinking in. Celeste, on the other hand, was completely in control. She took her time, letting the weight of the moment settle. 3 years, she repeated, her voice smooth, deliberate. And in those 3 years, how many times have you stopped a customer and accused them of stealing? Meredith swallowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. Celeste didn't let her escape. I asked you a question. Meredith finally forced herself to speak. Only when necessary. Celeste nodded slowly, as if considering the answer. And my son? What made him necessary? The air in the store felt heavier. Jalen could see the way some customers shifted, some leaning in closer, others looking away like they didn't want to get involved. But nobody left. Meredith straightened, desperately clinging to what little authority she had left. Like I said, he was acting suspiciously. Celeste tilted her head slightly. How? The question was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Meredith hesitated, but only for a second. He was looking around too much. Jalen let out a short laugh. Looking around? In a store? Celeste didn't react. She just kept her gaze locked onto Meredith. Anything else? Meredith shifted her weight. He had his hands in his pockets. Celeste exhaled. A quiet, measured breath. So did the man by the Jordan section. Meredith had nothing to say to that. Celeste let the silence stretch before speaking again. So, just to be clear, you profiled my son, publicly humiliated him, and threatened him with security. All because he was looking at shoes and had his hands in his pockets? Meredith's throat bobbed. She was running out of ground to stand on, and she knew it. Jalen watched as a few customers shifted, exchanging glances. The young cashier behind the counter looked horrified. Meredith finally shook her head. Look, I was just doing my job. Celeste let out a quiet chuckle. One that wasn't amused. Your job? She took another step forward, voice dropping just slightly. Let me tell you what your job is. She turned to the cashier. You. What's your name? The girl stiffened. Tasha. Celeste nodded. Tasha, when a customer walks in, what's your job? Tasha glanced at Meredith, then back at Celeste. To help them. Celeste nodded again, approving. And if they're interested in buying something? Tasha cleared her throat. We make sure they find the right size, answer any questions, and give them a good experience so they come back. Exactly. Celeste's gaze flicked back to Meredith. That's your job. Not to stand there playing security guard based on nothing but your own assumptions. Meredith's face had gone pale, her mouth set in a hard line. Celeste inhaled, then exhaled. So tell me, Meredith, do you think you did your job today? Meredith blinked. For the first time, she looked small. But Celeste wasn't finished. Not yet. Meredith's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to answer, but she hesitated. For the first time since this confrontation began, she seemed to understand the weight of what she had done. Jalen watched her closely. He wasn't expecting an apology. He wasn't naive. People like her rarely admitted they were wrong, but he wanted to see if she'd even try to justify herself now that she knew who she was talking to. Celeste let the silence drag, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. I built this business from the ground up. Her voice was even, but there was an edge to it now, something sharper beneath the surface. And I hired people under one condition, that they treat every customer with the same level of respect. Every single one. She took a step forward, and Meredith instinctively stepped back. Tell me, Meredith, Celeste continued, do you think you represented this store today? Do you think you upheld the values of Summit Kicks? Meredith's throat bobbed as she struggled to find an answer. I made a mistake. Jalen exhaled quietly. He almost laughed. That was the best she could do. Celeste's expression didn't soften. A mistake. She repeated the words slowly, tasting them. Do you know how many times people like you get to call this a mistake and move on? Do you know how many kids like my son don't get that same courtesy? Meredith had nothing to say. Celeste turned her gaze to the cashier. Tasha. Tasha straightened. Yes, ma'am. What do you think should happen to an employee who publicly humiliates a paying customer based on nothing but their own prejudice? Tasha's eyes widened slightly. She hesitated, but only for a second. Then, glancing at Meredith, she said quietly, They shouldn't be working here. Celeste nodded slowly, then looked back at Meredith. Meredith's face twisted. Wait, you can't be serious. Celeste raised an eyebrow. You work in retail, Meredith. You know how this goes. Customer service is about trust. If a customer doesn't feel welcome in my store, they won't come back. Meredith's hands balled into fists. I've worked here for 3 years. 3 years too long, apparently. Celeste's tone was almost casual. You didn't just embarrass my son. You embarrassed my store. You embarrassed yourself. Meredith opened her mouth, but Jalen spoke before she could. It's funny, though. His voice was calm, steady. You were real confident when you thought I was just some random kid. But now? Now you're nervous. Meredith glared at him. I'm not nervous. Jalen tilted his head slightly. Yeah? Then why do you look like you want to throw up? A few customers snickered. Even Tasha's lips twitched. Celeste exhaled, adjusting her blazer. Meredith, I'll make this easy for you. You can leave now, or I can call security and have you escorted out. Meredith's face turned red. You can't just... Celeste lifted a single finger. I can. Meredith's eyes darted around the store, looking for sympathy, for someone to defend her. But nobody did. Slowly, she grabbed her bag from behind the counter, her movement stiff, jerky. She turned, hesitating one last time, but Celeste didn't say another word. She simply folded her arms and waited. Meredith walked toward the door. She didn't storm out. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. But the moment she stepped outside, the store let out a collective breath. Someone near the back muttered. About time. Jalen turned to his mom, shaking his head. I didn't even want all this. I just wanted my shoes. Celeste gave him a small smile. Then let's get your shoes. Jalen chuckled, turning to Tasha. I'm still a size 11. Tasha grinned. Coming right up. But Celeste had one last thing to say before they walked out of that store. The tension in Summit Kicks had finally settled, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. Jalen leaned against the counter, watching as Tasha quickly grabbed his sneakers from the stockroom. Celeste took a slow look around the store. Customers had gone back to browsing, though some still threw glances their way. Employees looked relieved, but there was something else. Respect. They had just seen their boss handle something that should have never happened in the first place. Jalen tapped the shoebox as Tasha handed it over. "Thanks." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I'm really sorry that happened." Jalen gave a small nod. "Yeah, me too." Celeste pulled out her card to pay, but Tasha shook her head. "It's on the house." Jalen raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Tasha smiled. 100%. Celeste glanced at her, then nodded approvingly. "Thank you." As they walked toward the exit, Jalen exhaled slowly. "Man, I was really just trying to get my shoes." Celeste smirked. "And you got them?" Jalen chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, but at what cost?" They stepped outside, the bright afternoon sun washing over them. Jalen rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the last bit of frustration still clinging to him. "You know what's crazy?" he said, glancing at his mother. "If you weren't the owner, this could have ended completely different." Celeste's smile faded slightly. She knew exactly what he meant. "It happens every day." Her voice was quieter now. "To kids just like you, and not all of them get a way out." Jalen stared at the box in his hands, running his fingers along the edges. "So, what now? You going to change some things?" Celeste's expression hardened. "Oh, absolutely. Starting with hiring managers who actually know how to manage." Jalen huffed a small laugh. "Yeah, Meredith was on a power trip. Like, it was personal." Celeste stopped walking and turned to him, her face thoughtful. "It was never about the shoes, Jalen. It was about control. People like her, they feel the need to put others in their place." Jalen nodded slowly, letting that sink in. Celeste adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "The lesson here isn't just about her getting fired. It's about how easy it was for her to assume the worst about you." Jalen tilted his head. "So what's the fix?" Celeste smiled softly. "Keep proving them wrong. Keep standing your ground. And most importantly," she placed a hand on his shoulder, "know your worth before anyone tries to tell you different." Jalen let out a deep breath, nodding. They reached the car, and before getting in, Jalen looked back at the store one last time. "You think she learned anything from this?" Celeste followed his gaze, then sighed. "Some people learn. Some just get bitter." Jalen smirked. "Well, at least I got my shoes." Celeste laughed. "You sure did." As they drove off, Jalen stretched out in the seat, letting the moment settle. He wasn't mad anymore, just thoughtful. And maybe, just maybe, someone in that store today walked away thinking a little differently. Because sometimes it only takes one moment to make someone see the truth. What do you think? Did Celeste handle it the right way? Ever had a moment like this? Let's talk in the comments. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this one.